Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to present you the last panel of the day. So we will try to make it interesting and keep you awake because it's been a very long day of some pretty sticky topics. So my name is Elsa Madrol. I am advisor and I've been general manager EMEA for Beryfy-VASP, which is Upbit's partner for travelable compliance. Today, we heard about the formidable changes that are taking place in the blockchain space. Blockchain to the mainstream was the topic of the day. Blockchain to the corporates, I might say, would have to be underpinned by effective policy. And it's a policy that has to protect consumers, promote innovation, and keep the criminals out. Now, that's a big ask. We've heard about several frameworks today. Chair McHenry said US policy is a wake-up call for the rest of the world. Here in Korea, we operate in a highly functioning, well-regulated market, and yet a large part of the world remains unregulated. We're going to talk about three things today. We're going to try to set the record straight. Where are we with global policy and regulation, really? Not just the US, not just here in Korea, but across the world. Liquidity. What impact has policy and regulation had on liquidity in global markets? And finally, we're going to try to close with some forward-thinking thoughts on where this is all going. So first, I'd like to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. Peter?
Hello, I'm Peter Kerstens. I am advisor for technological innovation and cybersecurity at the European Commission's Financial Services Department, and I have led the work on the European Union's markets and crypto assets regulatory framework.
Wonderful. Sandra?
Hello, everyone. Sandra Rowe, CEO of GBBC, the Global Blockchain Business Council. We are a nonprofit association based in Geneva, Switzerland, with more than 500 institutional members across 124 jurisdictions and disciplines.
Thank you. Tana?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tana Chong. I'm the Chief Policy Officer of the Responsible FinTech Institute, also a nonprofit based in Singapore. So until recently, I was with the Hong Kong government as well as the Financial Action Task Force, having worked on Hong Kong stablecoin legislation.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for being here today to discuss these topics. So Peter, I'm going to start with you. Working chronologically, markets and crypto assets regulation, otherwise known as MiCA in Europe, was the first most comprehensive framework of its kind, really. Can you talk about the vision? Why was MiCA so important at the time that it was written and put in force? What the challenges were? And then really today, looking back, what's worked, what hasn't worked so well?
Okay. Well, we started work on what became the MiCA regulation back in 2018. Now, in crypto times, that's the Middle Ages. That's a long time ago. It was at the back of the first big Bitcoin bubble, but also the ICO wave. And while many people were extremely concerned, in particular financial regulators were extremely concerned about Bitcoin and digital assets and so on, I and my team also saw a lot of opportunity in blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, and what it could do for value transmission and so on. So we set out to develop a framework to seize the opportunities of blockchain and digital asset technology while also addressing the risks as we saw them, with a view to create legal certainty for our companies, issuers of crypto assets, service providers in the crypto asset space, but also legal certainty for corporates and consumers that want to engage in this space. We also wanted to onshore crypto activity in the European Union. So while Europeans may not have flocked to digital assets in great masses, quite a few Europeans were interested in it, and they had a habit of going offshore. And we said, well, if they're going to engage in crypto asset markets, they may as well do so in the European Union within the regulatory sunlight. So onshoring crypto activity in the European Union was a second objective. And then the third objective was to preserve the European Union's single market. We are 27 countries that are joined together in the European Union, and we are based on the principle of free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. And if member states regulate something in a different way, that free movement is not assured because the rules change from country to country. And so we said, in order to maintain a common regulatory framework, or an internal market, we need to have a common regulatory framework for digital assets. So that was the third objective which we pursued. And so we proposed legislation of this kind, which was quite a challenge in the beginning because many financial regulators lived, and some still do live, in a state of denial. They think that if you just wish digital assets away, they'll go away. It won't happen. And I think that gradually they're coming around realizing that that's not a wise strategy. Blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology is here to stay. It offers enormous opportunities for rewiring the financial system, and we are better off engaging with it for our markets, but also ultimately for our companies, our corporates, and our consumers that stand to benefit a great deal from this. But getting people to appreciate and understand and be interested in blockchain technology was a major challenge. But we overcame the challenge, and the legislation was adopted. It was effectively agreed in 2022. It was adopted in 2023. It entered into application last year. So I think we are way ahead of quite a few jurisdictions, and we'd like to stay ahead.
Great. Thank you. Sandra, what do you think Chairman McHenry means by the U.S. is a wake-up call for the rest of the world? So how does U.S. policy fit in with the rest of the world? What's GBBC been working on? What are some of the challenges? What do you think?
Well, I want to temper that statement a bit with, it's been made very clear, and I don't think there's any question, it's a US going to lead in crypto attitude and playbook. I think the question will be who are going to be collaborators and who are going to be considered competitors and potentially even adversaries. And I think if there is a wake-up call, it would be that, as I mentioned in the previous panel, the level of coordinated effort now inside the US government across agencies and regulatory bodies is unprecedented. And that I would advise every government to take a look at and coordinate better, because that is one thing the US is doing very well.
Great. Thank you. And Tana, as a former Hong Kong regulator, FATF policy analyst, you have quite a broad view of this universe. What are your thoughts on policy developments in Asia and really from a global perspective?
Well, I would say, firstly, I agree very much with Peter. One day is quite long in crypto world. So I started developing the stablecoin legislation back in 2023, so right after I returned from the FATF Secretariat. And back then, it was the so-called crypto winter, where the Bitcoin price, I think they slide into under 20,000 US dollar. And right now, I don't need to even mention the price. So I think from Asian jurisdiction perspective, there are a couple of driving forces. So number one, it would be to adhere to the international standard, because Asian jurisdictions, they are more like the aspiring economies, and they're smaller in scale, of course, not to compare with US. And we keep it very close to our heart on the gold standard made by the BIS, the FSB, and the FATF. And that was exactly one of the main driving force where Hong Kong started putting together a crypto framework, which we started with the intermediary, that is the trading platform, back in 2019. That was an answer or a homework to the FATF because we were just past that mutual evaluation. And I'm quite sure quite a number of jurisdictions around the world still keep that exercise because right now in FATF, they still have the targeted update on jurisdictional framework every single year. And they still point out how many jurisdictions still haven't got a proper framework in place because that is apparently a risk to the global market. And then the second driving force would be, of course, to develop the market because over the past couple of years, things are changing very fast, and there is like tremendous interest coming from both the digital finance space as well as getting to be picked up in the traditional finance space. And that's why I would say over the past couple of years, the dynamics has changed a bit. So it's more pro-market, want to have an ecosystem that is conducive to financial innovation. And that is why I feel like the Asian markets, they're picking up very quickly and everyone sort of has an ambition or a vision to bring the capital into their hub and to start to converge the digital finance space with the TradFi space as well.
Thank you. This next question is really just out to anybody who wants to grab it. You know, builders are trying to figure out where to build. And they have to navigate regulation, and from one year to the next, one jurisdiction may look a lot more attractive than the next. So in the EU, for example, we've seen builders change EU locations because it suddenly becomes a lot cheaper to get a MiCA license in one jurisdiction than in another, for example. We're seeing migration to the Middle East, to Asia, to the US. Is this healthy? Is this what we want to be doing, or are we at the risk of something negative happening?
Maybe I can start on that because when Elsa is like laying out the question, a word comes to mind, and that what we always put in every single policy brief we write, and that is regulatory arbitrage. I think one of the drivers, if not the main, at the beginning of every development of a nascent space is to try to look around and see where is the easiest to start with. And that oftentimes turns into you try to figure out a gap in between jurisdiction, and that is how we policy nerd call regulatory arbitrage. That is not a good word in itself, but I would think it's not healthy or unhealthy as such as a dichotomy. It's just an inevitable stage of every development of a new market. And I think we are still in the middle of it. Maybe different speakers will have different view, but that is some inevitable stage that we have to go through as we try to bring regulatory harmony with jurisdictions, which I think is necessary so that we will ultimately have a global market for digital asset that will flow.
Any other comments?
I think the only thing I would add is no matter what business you are in, no matter what market you are in, nobody likes unpredictability or uncertainty or curveballs in any kind of space, really. So business likes certainty, and I think as an entrepreneur, if you have to think every year, every couple years, I need to move to a new jurisdiction, that is tough because it's also very wasteful and how much money you need to spend to then relocate and reimagine your situation. So the more certainty we have globally, the better it will be for each entrepreneur to make a decision about where they want to create a home base if there is a home base to be had. But I think more certainty would be better.
But also, I think that if the choice of jurisdiction where you want to license is going to be a major factor in the choice of your business, you probably got things wrong because the regulatory environment shouldn't be the main driver for your business. The main driver should be how to compete, how to offer good products to or how to offer solutions to a problem in the market, and how to grow. And yes, companies are relocating, and it's a bit strange within the European Union because all 27 member states have the same rules. And yet, because they all have the same rules, and still we see companies relocating. And that has to do with something Sandra commented on, is that while the rules are the same everywhere, the attitude of the regulators is not the same everywhere. And it's extremely important in a new space where you want to innovate that you have an enabling and positive attitude, a can-do attitude on the part of the regulator. And what we see is that a number of companies that initially were established in one member state of the European Union did not find that the local regulator was enabling, had the right attitude for their business, and therefore they decided to move to another jurisdiction because there the attitude of the regulator was more positive. But using as business strategy to undercut the rules, I think is a very bad strategy, and there really is very little scope to do that as more and more countries come online in developing a regulatory framework. We see the US has made major moves. They're still working with their stablecoin framework. They're still working on a market structure framework. They have strong disciplines in anti-money laundering regulation and so on. So really, shopping around for jurisdiction or for regulator isn't really a good business strategy in my view.
I'll shift gears a little bit. Liquidity was mentioned several times today. It's an important component of any financial market, but it's absolutely critical to crypto because of the inherently global nature of the asset. So in Korea, liquidity is plentiful on highly regulated exchanges, but that isn't the case in the rest of the world. We've seen liquidity move very quickly, generally from more regulated to less regulated venues. We've even seen liquidity exit a market altogether. I think we saw that in the EU with the stablecoin policy. Do you think we will see liquidity migrate to regulated venues globally? And what's it going to take? Is the Korean model, for example, something that the rest of the world should aspire to? Sandra, you're shaking your head yes, so I'm going to start with you.
I'm going to say something that may not make some of the audience very happy, but I'll say it anyway. Once you have serious institutional, regulated institutions in particular, coming into markets, and crypto being one, it will move and shift to regulated and well-established jurisdictions, because regulated financial institutions will not play in places that are either ambiguous or considered looser about their regulatory oversight. That is just not going to happen. So I think once institutions start really coming in, that's when you'll see that shift. Like I said, may not make everyone happy, but that's my take on it.
Please.
And also, it's still a relatively new market. And in finance, traditionally, we see that liquidity begets liquidity. If you have liquidity, it attracts more of it. We currently have quite a lot of centralized trading venues across the world. And I do not know of another asset class that has so many different trading venues. Is this going to last? Possibly. But it's also possible that we will see in due course a consolidation, and that the liquidity ends up being pooled in a number of the larger players. Who these larger players are going to be, who knows? But I think that gradually, as this market matures, we will see a concentration of the liquidity in a number of larger venues.
Yeah, I very much agree with the observations of Sandra and Peter, and I would just add some observations from Hong Kong. So we have VA trading platforms framework going live from 2023. And this year, we see a bit of traction converging the traditional financial space with the digital finance space. So it's not like HSBC going bullish and suddenly say, we'll invest in BTC. It's not the case. And in fact, they're still saying is still very far away from that. But then you will see some tokenization steps and projects and collaboration between traditional finance players and digital finance players. For example, we have tokenized MMF, money market funds, between very, very traditional fund houses and licensed crypto exchange. And I just want to pinpoint that this is happening and it will happen because if you want more mainstream adoption, it means that the traditional players or the big players, they will come in. In Hong Kong, that is the case for example, family office, traditional securities firm. They are all getting their securities license uplifting to start to get into the tokenization RWA space. If that will happen, it definitely means that liquidity will go and cluster around the licensed venues instead of the otherwise.
And there's an interesting point that I always make from the travel rule perspective is that the user experience in a regulated environment does change. I think all of our Korean users here can attest to that. How you traded in the past is not going to be how you trade in the future. Similarly to financial markets, past performance is no indication of the future. There is a user experience that has to change. But I think what we've seen is that in the longer term, that's actually appreciated by users because they find it to be a safer environment to be
just to jump in on that point, in Hong Kong, we also have a digital bank where, because you mentioned user experience, so as a banking client for a digital bank, you can now buy crypto directly from that banking app. And I feel like this is maybe a baby step, but then like the impression and the signal that it's sending is massive.
A question to each of the panelists. What policy and regulatory changes do you think are needed? This is a very broad question to create the right global market structure. What do you think we still need to see from today?
That is a tough one because can you think of any market industry that has a truly global regulatory framework that works in one size fits all? It doesn't really exist. Look at our existing financial services. There are large frameworks and they have what they call ability to be recognized by different jurisdictions, but they tend to still stay in a very kind of localized regional way. So I think the best way to answer that question is we need to have conversations at the regulatory level or with the bodies, like you mentioned before, who bring together central banks, that bring together global regulators, and try to make sure that there's not too much distance and gaps between what is being legislated or passed locally. I don't think we're going to change and all of a sudden have a global regulatory framework that works for everyone. It's just not a realistic goal.
I fully subscribe to that. While the business may be global and borderless, policy and regulation are always, and legislation are always local. And while countries and jurisdictions compare notes and they plagiarize each other's legislation, and that's a good thing, they take their own decisions based on their own priorities, preferences, and structure. There really is no international regulatory structure that can promulgate rules. There can be some standards for coordination, but really there is no global government or global parliament or global legislator that can adopt rules for the entire world. And I think that while we are all humans and we're all the same, values and preferences and ideas vary. And I represent the European Commission in the innovation work in, for example, the G20, the Financial Stability Board. And this is very interesting because we meet there regulators and policymakers from the largest 20 economies. Actually, there are a few more than 20 there. And you see that perspectives really change. Although the fundamental objectives are all the same. Everyone wants financial stability, everyone wants consumer protection, everyone wants market integrity, everyone wants to prevent money laundering, and so on. But how you do that, that really is for every country for itself to determine.
Yeah. I think over the past few years, global jurisdictions or international organizations, they always talk about one notion when they write legislation and regulation, and that is the same activity, same risk, same regulation approach. But I think after a few years, it may be time for us to rethink what exactly is same activity and same risk, because this is a novel space. Things we do finance or we move money not exactly in the same way we used to do with traditional finance players, and maybe it's time to think about how we can really tailor the rules to what the market needs or what the reality is doing right now out there. And by that default, because there is no global government or no global parliament, I would argue that that is an inherent gap or a shortcoming for the public sector, that is something that we can barely achieve within the public sector. And this is something for the businesses out there and for the private sector to build this communication gap, to build this reality vis-a-vis rule gap, and to really convey to the government, well, actually, that is something maybe missing in your rules. And that is still all right, because that is how public policies are made. Everybody has a public mandate. You can't really change things overnight. But then it's still all right. But then I think it's about time for private sectors to gather around and to really communicate that regularly to the public sector, as well as to reach out to the public, to do this public communication work, to build a trust. Because from my perspective, maybe I'm biased because I've been spending time in FedEv, and we get regular updates on the typologies of how people abuse blockchain and crypto to move billions and billions of money, of dirty money, in seconds or minutes time. And that's why people are freaked out, and that's also normal. But then that is something which a very precious role that organizations like GBBC, like RFI, and like others can do, and to constantly communicate with regulators. And I very much agree that some regulators, okay, they vary in attitude, but some regulators are more open-minded and they are willing to listen. And I truly appreciate how some international organizations, they provide regular and standardized forum for private sector to reach out and to reflect the community. And I think all of us in the room have a role to play in this regard.
Yeah, I think it's sorry. It's interesting to think what AI can do to accelerate policymakers' ability to catch up with what's going on really in the private sector. It's a topic for a different panel, but I agree with you.
But if I could piggyback on what Hannah just said, I completely agree that I think sometimes, and I will take full responsibility as well when I was in private sector, that somehow we just expect the regulators just to come up with things and that they should have that responsibility all on the public sector side. But reality is we need the private sector to step up as this industry is maturing and come up with industry standards, come up with best practices, come up with that, and have the dialogue as it evolves and grows and scales to trillions and trillions. That's the only way we're going to close the gaps. To put it all on public sector and say, Peter, it's all on you, or to say it is just the regulator's job, that is not fair, and also it's not realistic.
So the private sector is often tasked with interoperability. Whether you are a blockchain looking to be interoperable with another blockchain, a travel rule service provider having pressure to become interoperable with others, blockchain analytics firms. And very often, the hurdle to that interoperability is a lack of harmonization across regulation. So it's a little bit of a vicious circle. Do you think we will ever get to a point where we see mutual recognition? So it started to happen in the US with US states, so that's definitely a step in the right direction. But will we ever see, for example, Singapore recognize mutual recognition with another regulator?
Well, it's a very difficult question again, and I would say it will happen, but it will take very, very long. And maybe over time it will be a natural selection because there is time for the market to test out like rich regulation or rich set of rule book is better, and there will be natural forces trying to make the public sector change their rules. But then it will definitely take very long. So unfortunately, the challenge will remain for at least a decade or so. I'm drawing this time frame reference from, I remember when I just joined the government, in Hong Kong, there was an initiative called like Fund Passport. So it's the same. You try to get other jurisdictions to recognize also your framework, but then inevitably the discussion will bring in different consideration beyond strictly evidence-based policy making. And what I'm talking about is geopolitics and other things. And like competition, if you talk about Hong Kong and Singapore, people just think about competition, but it's actually not the case. There is a lot of cooperation. But when it comes to who should recognize whose rules, it's a different story. And it would just take the time. And I would tend to think that it's more useful to rely on like the market force to make this happen, to drive the best practices. And I echo with you a lot, Elsa, on the travel rule implementation, because like after about 6 years of like having the travel rule in place, we're still talking about it's not happening, it's not interoperable. And it's the same arguments over time, and you get to hear this twice a year at least at the FedF, and it starts to get so boring. I'm so sorry to say, but then like we all know the problem, but then the solution isn't appearing, isn't emerging. And that means like the status quo isn't working, and we need some other initiative or like project to bring everyone converge towards the standard. And that is, again, the necessary pain. But I guess we can all take it naturally because like the banking regulation took about a century to develop and to come to its present state. So we are only maybe a decade or so into crypto. So let's just take the time and meanwhile enjoy the fun.
Peter, can I grill you on passporting in the European Union?
Yes.
Can you talk to us about passporting? What does it mean? Is it working, so to speak?
Yes. The passporting in the European Union means that if you have a license in one member state, you can use that license to do business in all the other member states. So the other member states recognize your license from or your passport from the member state, your home member state where you got your license. And that applies to both issuers of crypto assets under MiCA, but also to service providers, to custodians, to trading venues, to brokers, and so on. And this principle works well, and there's not a lot of exceptions to it in MiCA, but the passporting is mainly for licensing purposes, so your license is valid. It reaches also to a large extent conduct of business rules where they are harmonized, but then there are always certain rules which are not harmonized, like for example certain investor protection rules. And there you sometimes have to comply with the rules of the country of destination. And compare it a little bit with a driver's license. A driver's license is in a way a passport. With your driver's license, I live in Belgium, with my driver's license from Belgium, I'm allowed to drive in all the member states of the European Union. And when the United Kingdom was still a member of the European Union, I was allowed to drive with my driver's license in the United Kingdom. But if I go to the United Kingdom, I have to drive on, for me, the wrong side of the road. Because the United Kingdom would not accept that I would behave as I would behave back home, for my own safety and for the safety of its own drivers. So it's not so, and a lot of people confuse this, that it's not so that because you have a passport, you can just behave like at home. It's just like a travel passport. You have a travel passport, this allows you to travel around the world, but if you go to another country, you have to respect the rules of that country.
Sandra, we had extensive discussions in the derivatives markets on equivalence. Do you think we'll ever get to something that looks like that in crypto?
I actually do. I'm a fairly glass half full kind of person. I think the markets will figure out interoperability from a technical standpoint. I think we will have equivalency for the most part over time. It may take some time. But I do think if it's important enough and the industry becomes big enough, we will solve these problems.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our questions. I wanted to open it up to the floor in case anybody in the audience had any questions for our panelists. But it's been a long day, so I didn't expect many. So I will close by giving you each 1 minute to talk about what do you think we will be talking about on this stage this time next year from a global policy perspective. And I will start to give you 30 seconds to think about what you're going to say. I touched upon it a little bit. I do think we're on the verge of an AI revolution when it comes to the public sector, meaning policymakers and supervisors are going to have these tools to accelerate their understanding, to accelerate their supervisory capabilities. And I think we will talk about AI a lot more this time next year on our policy panels.
Well, I fear that this time next year, we will still be talking a lot about stable coins. I hope we won't, because while stable coins are very important, they're a very important step towards the Web3 community and having the Web3 environment, be able to make payments on-chain and so on. I very much hope that they are not the end stage of blockchain development, because blockchain is so powerful, and if stablecoins is all blockchains and digital assets have to offer, it really isn't very exciting. What I hope we will be talking about this time next year is the tokenization of real-world assets, tokenization of financial instruments, equity, bonds, funds, and so on. These markets are vastly, vastly, vastly bigger than the crypto asset markets. Now, people have been saying, oh, we have $4 billion market capitalization in crypto assets. That's a lot of money. But compare this to global equity markets. There is a company, NVIDIA, which is almost as big as the entire crypto space. So if you look at all the listed companies in the world, if you look at all of their equity, all of their debt, these markets are massive. And if we can bring tokenization to those markets, then we have something going.
Next year, hard to predict, but I hope, one, we will hear that there is more certainty in South Korea, because South Korea is an engine for digital assets. And actually, many of the, I think, legislation and also frameworks that come out of Korea could eventually be also leadership level frameworks or examples for other countries around the world. That's one. So everyone get to work. Number two, I do hope we will hear more about real-world asset tokenization scaling. I know from financial institutions I speak to, there is a lot of frustration that they have invested a lot of time and money and effort into projects and pilots. They need to scale, and businesses need to make money, because they're getting asked by their CEOs and executives, what is the return on this investment? And that needs to start happening. So I hope we will see the business opportunities come to light in RWA, but also I'd like to see South Korea stepping up with some really interesting frameworks and legal clarity, or regulatory clarity.
Well, firstly, I would also place my bet on the possibility that we'll be talking about RWA next year this time, because it's really happening. And then when people talk about RWA, right now the knowledge level still remains on, okay, we can tokenize maybe our flat and sell a fraction of it, but then how does it happen and how can it take place? There is not much discussion and not much solid framework over it around the globe. So this is happening. And number two, I hope we are not talking about stablecoin only again, for the whole coming year. But then take a step back and take a broader perspective to really reimagine the future of money, because stablecoin is just only one form of payment. I think in broader perspective, we are in the process of replicating the whole TradFi world and migrate on-chain. And that's why that explains you have like tokenized bond, you have crypto, you have stable coins, you have CBDC, tokenized deposit, and everything. And I think our imagination shouldn't stop there. We'll just let the business, let the market innovate and see what are the new exciting opportunities they can bring onto the stage. In Hong Kong, I've heard about idea of tokenizing a cruise with Hello Kitty on it, and that would blend in like cruise, like a real asset, Hello Kitty, which is an IP, and everything. But then I only heard the concept and nothing more, and that goes back to my curiosity of like as policymaker, how can we bring them into reality? And on this, I have a lot of hope on Korea because Korea leads culture on many fronts, the K-pop, the K-culture, and like a lot of things. And I think we have a lot of possibilities to explore together, public sector and private sector as a whole. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights, and thank you for sticking with us to the very end and for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.